The dust on Gideon's rock tasted of rust and regret. It was a fine, red-gold powder that coated everything, a constant reminder of the moon's iron-rich, unforgiving geology and the slow decay of human ambition. Kalen breathed it in, the metallic tang familiar on his tongue, as he calibrated the magnetic clamps on a failing atmospheric processor. The hulking machine, a relic from a forgotten exodus, groaned under his touch, its metal skin a patchwork of mismatched plates and crude welds. It was ugly, loud, and inefficient, much like the colony it served. Below him, nestled in the permanent twilight of a deep canyon, the settlement of Haven sprawled like a scatter of discarded metal boxes, its lights a feeble constellation against the overwhelming dark. For 2 centuries, this had been humanity's last, best secret, a forgotten pocket of existence in the swirling, chaotic arms of the Seraphim Nebula, a place where the ghosts of a fallen empire could hide. Kalen had been born in that shadow, had learned to walk on decks salvaged from derelict freighters, and had learned his trade from grizzled engineers who spoke of Earth as a half-remembered dream. He was a master of a dying art, the care and maintenance of brute force technology, of systems built with redundancies and thick armor, designed not with elegance, but with the grim expectation of failure. He preferred the solid, predictable logic of machinery to the messy unpredictability of people. Machines didn't lie. They either worked or they broke. And if they broke, you could usually beat them with a wrench until they worked again. His focus was shattered by a crackle in his ear, Mara's voice cutting through the static of his comms unit, sharp and devoid of pleasantries. "Kalen, get to the Overlook. Now." There was a tension in her tone he hadn't heard in years, a brittle edge that scraped against his nerves. Mara, the colony's elected leader, was the rock upon which Haven was built. A woman whose face was a roadmap of past hardships. She was the anchor of their small community, the keeper of their history, and their fiercest protector. She didn't rattle easily. Kalen wiped a grease-stained hand across his brow, leaving a dark smear on his skin. "I'm in the middle of keeping Processor 4 from shaking itself apart. Can it wait?" The processor chose that moment to shudder violently, sending a tremor through the catwalk he stood on. "See," he added dryly. The reply was immediate and absolute. "No, it cannot." He sighed, the sound lost in the groan of aging machinery. He gave the processor one last, resentful pat, grabbed his toolkit, and began the climb up the canyon wall toward the Overlook, Haven's primary command and observation deck. The air grew thinner, colder, as he ascended, the ever-present crimson dust swirling around him in the weak currents generated by the colony's ventilation shafts. The Overlook was crowded, a rare sight. The usual skeleton crew was supplemented by the grim-faced members of the Colony Council, their anxiety a palpable hum in the cramped space. Mara stood before the main viewport, a vast pane of armored glass that looked out into the roiling, ethereal clouds of the nebula. Her back was ramrod straight, her hands clasped behind her, but Kalen could see the white of her knuckles even from the doorway. He followed her gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. Hanging in the void, just beyond the edge of their sensor-baffling nebula, was a ship. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a sliver of polished obsidian and glowing silver light, impossibly sleek and elegant. It moved with a silent, predatory grace, absorbing the faint light of distant stars rather than reflecting it. It was a thing of beauty and terror, a stark contrast to the utilitarian, blocky designs of human-made vessels that lay dormant in Haven's hidden hangars. It was a ship of the Stellar Covenant. The stories were sparse, fragmented tales passed down through generations. But every child in Haven knew the name. The Covenant was a vast, ancient coalition of species, a galactic power that preached order and technological purity. They were the reason humanity was hiding in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. They had shattered Earth's fleets, dismantled its fledgling empire, and scattered its people to the winds, all in the name of bringing a chaotic and primitive species into their enlightened fold. "It's a Pathfinder-class cruiser," a voice murmured beside him. It was Jorik, Haven's chief of security, a man whose weary eyes had seen too many close calls. Top-of-the-line exploratory vessel. They must have punched through the nebula's interference by accident. Mara turned from the window, her gaze sweeping over the assembled council before landing on Kalen. "They've hailed us," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the fear that was coiling in Kalen's gut. "They know we're here." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Being found was the nightmare scenario, the boogeyman that had haunted their people for 200 years. Kalen felt a cold, familiar cynicism wash over him. All their hiding, all their scraping and struggling, had just been a delay of the inevitable. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice flatter than he intended. Mara's eyes, chips of hard, gray flint, met his. "They offered us a choice. Surrender for reintegration or be cleansed." The word hung in the air, sterile and obscene. Reintegration was a Covenant euphemism for a life of servitude, of having your culture and identity stripped away to be replaced by the rigid doctrines of the Stellarch. Cleansing was simpler. It meant annihilation. The council erupted. The arguments were predictable, a desperate cacophony of fear and pride. Some argued for surrender, for survival at any cost. Others spoke of fighting, of dying on their feet rather than living on their knees. Kalen listened, a sour taste in his mouth. They were talking about fighting a phantom. They had no real idea of the Covenant's capabilities beyond legends and scary stories. Their own fleet consisted of a half-dozen mothballed gunships and a single ancient frigate that hadn't flown in 50 years. Their defenses were a network of kinetic cannons designed to shoot down pirates and stray asteroids, not to engage a military cruiser. It was a fool's errand. "We have to fight," a councilwoman insisted, her voice trembling with passion. "We are the last free humans in the galaxy." Kalen scoffed, the sound louder than he meant it to be. All eyes turned to him, with what he challenged, gesturing vaguely towards the viewport, where a town of mechanics and farmers with a handful of museum pieces for ships. "That thing out there is a shark, and we're a school of minnows. It'll tear us apart without even trying." His words landed like stones in the charged atmosphere. He saw the anger in some faces, the despair in others. He didn't care. He dealt in reality, in the cold, hard facts of physics and engineering. And the reality was, they were doomed. Mara held up a hand, silencing the brewing storm. "Kalen is right," she said, her voice cutting through the dissent. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Their energy shields alone could withstand anything our plasma cannons can throw at them. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But that doesn't mean we are without options." She turned her gaze back to Kalen, and for the first time, he saw something other than weary resolve in her eyes. It was a glimmer of something dangerous, something desperate. "Their technology is elegant, refined," she mused, almost to herself. "It is built on precision, on delicate energy matrices and complex systems. What happens when you hit something so pristine with something crude?" Kalen frowned, not following her line of thought. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Mara walked over to a dusty schematic console in the corner of the overlook. She blew a layer of red dust off the screen and tapped a few commands. An old, faded blueprint flickered to life, displaying a cross-section of the canyon in which Haven was built. Deep beneath the colony, embedded in the very bedrock of the moon, was a massive, sprawling installation. Kalen recognized it instantly. The mass driver. He breathed. It was the ultimate relic, a weapon from a bygone era of human warfare, a time when subtlety was a luxury and brute force was a doctrine. It was an enormous electromagnetic catapult, a series of colossal magnetic rings running for miles through the moon's crust, designed for a single, simple purpose: to hurl multi-ton chunks of rock into space at relativistic speeds. It hadn't been powered on in over a century. It was considered a monument, a tombstone for a forgotten age of warfare. "It's a piece of junk," Kalen said dismissively. "The power conduits are shot, the capacitor banks are dust, and the targeting system is, well, it was never that good to begin with." He remembered the stories from the old engineers, how the driver was notoriously inaccurate, a sledgehammer in an age of scalpels. "Exactly," Mara said, a grim smile touching her lips. "The Covenant values precision. Their shields are designed to dissipate energy plasma, lasers, particle beams. They're woven from pure force, but they've never faced anything like this. A 10,000-ton chunk of solid iron hitting them at a measurable fraction of light speed isn't energy. It's physics. It's a problem of inertia and kinetic force." The council was silent, staring at the schematic as if seeing a ghost. The mass driver was their deepest secret and their greatest shame, a weapon of such indiscriminate power that their ancestors had vowed never to use it again. To even consider reactivating it was an act of profound desperation. Kalen stared at the flickering blueprint, his engineer's mind already racing, cataloging the hundreds of things that could go wrong. The power surge alone could black out the entire colony, and that was if the ancient capacitors didn't just explode. A misfire could crack the moon's crust. A targeting error could send a mountain-sized projectile careening into their own settlement. It was insane. It was impossible. And yet, a tiny, unfamiliar spark flickered in the cynical void of his chest. The image of the sleek Covenant ship, so perfect, so arrogant, hanging in the void, flashed in his mind. The thought of smashing that perfection with a giant, primitive rock was, he had to admit, deeply appealing. He looked from the schematic to Mara, whose gaze was fixed on him, challenging him. She knew he was the only one who could even attempt to bring the monstrous weapon back to life. "Give me a team and all the power you can spare," Kalen heard himself say, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. "And pray to whatever gods you believe in that this whole moon doesn't fall apart when we flip the switch." Mara nodded once, a silent and heavy agreement. The decision was made. As the council members dispersed, their faces a mixture of grim determination and abject terror, Mara placed a hand on Kalen's shoulder. "I know you think this is a long shot," she said quietly. He just grunted in response. "It's more than that. It's a prayer in the dark." He turned to leave, the weight of their collective survival settling on him like a shroud. Before he reached the door, Mara spoke again. "Kalen, their commander had a name, Praetor Xylar. He spoke of our presence here as an untidy variable that needed to be corrected. He sounded bored." Kalen stopped, his hand on the doorframe. He looked back at the viewport, at the perfect, deadly ship waiting patiently to erase them. Bored. The sheer, cosmic arrogance of it stoked the spark in his chest into a tiny, smoldering coal of fury. "Let's give him something to get excited about," he muttered, and stepped out into the red dust to go wake a monster. The descent into the driver's primary control nexus was like a journey into the planet's gut. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and dormant power. Thick, armored conduits, as wide as a man's torso, lined the walls of the cavernous chamber, all converging on a central command sphere that hung suspended in the gloom by massive support struts. This was the heart of the weapon, a place that hadn't seen a living soul in decades. And Kalen and his hand-picked team of engineers, a few grizzled veterans, and a handful of younger, wide-eyed technicians who had grown up on his stories moved through the space with portable floodlights, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness and revealing the scale of their task. Dust lay in thick blankets over every surface, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. They worked in a feverish, focused silence, their movements economical and precise. They bypassed fused circuits, rerouted power through auxiliary conduits, and manually cranked open coolant valves that had been sealed shut since before their grandparents were born. Kalen moved like a man possessed. His earlier cynicism burned away by the raw, terrifying challenge of the machine. This was a language he understood. The driver wasn't just a weapon. It was a testament to human ingenuity at its most brutal and ambitious. It was a symphony of raw power. And he was its conductor. Hours bled into one another. Above them, they knew. The Covenant ship was moving. Praetor Xylar's patience wearing thin. A message had been broadcast from the Pathfinder, its tone no longer bored, but laced with a cold, final condescension. Their time was up. The cleansing would begin on the next orbital pass. Jorik's voice crackled over the comm, tense and strained. They're in a low, intimidating orbit, making a slow pass over the canyon. I think they mean to make a show of it. Kalen didn't look up from the master power console he was rewiring. His knuckles were bloody, his face slick with a mixture of sweat and grime. Let them watch, he grunted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was done. A young technician, Leah, gave him a shaky thumbs up from across the control sphere. The last of the capacitor banks was online. Kalen took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at the faces of his team, illuminated in the eerie green glow of the ancient consoles. They were exhausted, terrified, but their eyes shone with a defiant light. He strapped himself into the gunner's chair, a throne of pitted metal and cracked leather, and gripped the twin control yokes. On the main view screen, a grainy, low-resolution targeting display flickered to life. He could see the schematic of the orbital path of the Covenant ship, a smooth, arrogant curve. The system was too old to get a proper lock. He would have to time it perfectly, leading the target like a hunter from an ancient age, powering the magnetic rings. He announced, his voice echoing in the cavern. A low hum began to build, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up through the floor, through the chair, and into his bones. The lights in the control sphere flickered, and the entire moon seemed to groan in protest. On the surface, the lights of Haven dimmed as every spare watt of power was diverted deep into the planet's crust. On the bridge of the Covenant Pathfinder, Praetor Xylar watched the energy readings from the moon's surface spike with a flicker of mild curiosity. The primitives were doing something, a last, futile act of defiance. No doubt. It was almost pitiable. He gestured languidly to his weapons officer. Target their primary settlement. A single, surgical strike to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Let's not be unnecessarily cruel. Below. Kalen's eyes were locked on the targeting display. The hum of the driver was now a deafening roar. The very rock around them was vibrating with contained power. Loading projectile, he said, his teeth clenched. Deep in the heart of the driver, immense grav lifts positioned a carefully selected asteroid onto the launch track. A jagged oblong chunk of iron ore the size of a small building. The target indicator on his screen crept closer to the firing solution. He could feel the seconds stretching into infinity. He thought of Xylar's bored voice, of 2 centuries spent hiding in the dark, of the defiant faces of his crew. This wasn't just a rock. It was 200 years of fear, of anger, of stubborn, unrelenting survival. It was their answer. The indicator flashed green. Kalen slammed his fist down on the firing stud. Fire, he roared, his voice lost in the world-shattering crescendo as the mass driver, humanity's sleeping giant, finally woke up. For a fraction of a second, the universe held its breath. The launch of the projectile was not a sound but a sensation, a tectonic upheaval that ripped through the very fabric of Gideon's rock. In the control sphere, Kalen was slammed back into his chair as the entire moon shuddered. A deep, grinding protest from a celestial body subjected to forces it was never meant to bear. The roar was all-consuming, a physical entity that hammered at his chest and skull, drowning out the screams of tortured metal and the panicked shouts of his team. Consoles sparked, overhead lights shattered, and a web of cracks spread across the armored glass of the main view screen. Then, as suddenly as it began, there was silence, a profound, ringing quiet broken only by the hiss of a ruptured coolant pipe and the ragged, desperate gasps of the engineers picking themselves up from the floor. Kalen's ears rang. His vision swam, but his eyes were locked on the grainy display. He had fired blind, a calculated guess based on orbital mechanics and sheer, unadulterated hope. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The Covenant ship continued its graceful, arrogant sweep, a perfect, unbroken line against the tapestry of the nebula. He had missed. The thought was a cold and sharp blade in his gut. All that power, all that destruction, for nothing. But then he saw it. Not the projectile itself, for it was moving too fast, a ghost of kinetic energy, but its effect. A flicker on the Pathfinder's shield, a brief, localized shimmer of impossible brilliance. It wasn't the diffuse and blooming dissipation of an energy weapon impact. It was a sharp, angry point of light that held for an infinitesimal moment before the shield. A marvel of Covenant engineering designed to repel suns. Simply failed. There was no explosion in the traditional sense, no glorious bloom of fire and light. There was only a silent, catastrophic violation. The 10,000-ton chunk of iron ore, a piece of the very moon they stood on, struck the Pathfinder's midsection. The sleek, obsidian hull, a material designed to withstand the rigors of deep space and the fury of plasma cannons, did not bend or buckle. It shattered. An entire section of the ship, hundreds of meters long, ceased to exist, replaced by a rapidly expanding cloud of shrapnel, frozen atmosphere, and the silent, tumbling forms of the crew. The Pathfinder, a vessel of perfect symmetry and grace, was now a mangled, broken thing. Gutted and disemboweled, it began to tumble, end over end, its elegant lights flickering and dying. A great, mortally wounded Leviathan bleeding its life into the void. A strangled cheer erupted from Leah, raw and incredulous. It broke the spell, and the control sphere came alive with stunned, choked laughter and shouts of disbelief. They had done it. The junkyard mechanics and dirt farmers of Haven had landed a killing blow on a god. Kalen could only stare, his hand still gripping the control yoke so tightly his knuckles were white. He felt a dizzying surge of savage, primitive triumph. He had thrown a rock at the heavens, and the heavens had bled. The elation was fleeting, burned away by the sudden, frantic crackle of his comm unit. It was Mara, her voice tight with a new kind of urgency. "Kalen, report. What in God's name did you do?" The connection was unstable, cutting in and out. "Structural integrity alarms are going off all over the colony. We have pressure breaches in the lower levels, and the main power grid is down." Kalen's triumph curdled into cold dread. He toggled the comms. The driver fired. He said, his voice hoarse, "Target is hit." "Repeat." "Target is crippled, but the recoil, it feels like the whole moon is coming apart. We're reading massive geological stress fractures along the entire length of the driver." He unstrapped himself, his legs shaky as he stood. "We woke the monster. Mara, now we have to live with the consequences." On the overlook, the view was one of controlled chaos. Yorick was barking orders, dispatching emergency crews to the damaged sectors. Mara watched the dying Covenant ship on the main screen, her face a mask of grim satisfaction and mounting anxiety. She had known there would be a cost. She just hadn't anticipated it being so immediate, so violent. They had won the first exchange, but they had done it by breaking their own home. She saw a new flicker of light from the crippled Pathfinder. Not an explosion, but the distinct, sharp burn of maneuvering thrusters. It was righting itself, stabilizing its tumble. It wasn't dead yet. Her blood ran cold. Aboard the bridge of the Pathfinder, the emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows across a scene of carnage. Praetor Xylar stood amidst the wreckage, a shallow cut on his temple, the only visible sign of the violence that had just torn his ship and his worldview asunder. His command staff was decimated, his bridge a ruin of shattered consoles and dead officers. He looked at the gaping hole in his vessel on the tactical display, and then at the readings from the moon below. Primitive, uncouth, a kinetic weapon. They had thrown a rock at him. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was an insult far deeper than the physical damage to his ship. The boredom he had felt earlier was a distant memory, replaced by a cold, crystalline rage that was terrifying in its purity. He had intended to correct an untidy variable. Now, he would sterilize a world. "Commander," he said, his voice unnervingly calm as he addressed the highest-ranking survivor. "What is the status of our ground assault contingent?" The commander, a hulking or reptilian Zeth, picked himself up from the deck. "The first cohort is intact." "Praetor, their drop bays were shielded by the main reactor core. They are ready for deployment." Xylar's thin lips curled into something that was not a smile. "Excellent. Their objective has changed. This is no longer a cleansing. It is a dissection. I want that weapon. I want the primitives who built it. And I want them alive. I want to understand the desperate, animal cunning that led them to desecrate their own world in a pathetic attempt to defy us." He turned his gaze to the viewport, to the red, dusty moon that had dared to fight back. "Deploy the first cohort. Take the settlement. Secure the weapon, and bring me the one who fired it." The first warning Haven had of the impending invasion was not a sensor reading, but a visual, streaks of fire in the sky. Dozens of them, arcing down from the wounded Pathfinder, shedding their orbital velocity as they screamed towards the canyon. "Drop ships. They're coming for us." Jorik breathed, his voice heavy with grim finality. The initial euphoria of their victory evaporated, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of what was to come. They had won a battle in space, but now the war was coming to their homes, to their workshops, to their families. Mara's mind raced. Their defenses were designed for external threats. The kinetic cannons were useless against targets already inside the atmosphere. Their small security force was armed with plasma rifles and stun batons. A police force, not an army. They were not equipped for a ground war against a trained Covenant cohort. Her gaze fell on the internal schematic of the colony, the intricate network of tunnels, maintenance shafts, and industrial machinery, and her eyes, once again, found Kalen. His voice came over the comm, cutting through the rising panic in the overlook. "Mara, they're coming down, aren't they?" There was no surprise in his tone, only a weary resignation. "Yes," she replied. "They'll be on the ground in minutes." A long pause stretched over the comlink. Kalen was standing in the driver's control sphere, watching his team frantically trying to contain the damage from the firing. The very air thrummed with the weapon's painful aftershocks. He was an engineer, a man who fixed things. He wasn't a soldier, but looking at the schematics of the colony that were still on his screen, he saw something else. He saw a machine, a complex, interconnected system of power conduits, atmospheric processors, industrial smelters, and magnetic cargo movers. A machine that could be broken, yes, but also a machine that could be weaponized. "Mara," he said slowly, an idea taking shape in his mind. A terrible, desperate, and beautiful idea. The Covenant thinks they're invading a colony. Let's show them they're invading a death trap. Mara's knuckles were white where she gripped the console. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This whole colony is a relic," Kalen explained, his words coming faster now, the engineer in him taking over, seeing the problem and formulating a solution. "Everything is over-engineered, built with brute force. We have plasma smelters that can melt tungsten. We have atmospheric vents that can flash freeze a compartment in seconds. The magnetic rails for the cargo trams. If you overload the power feed, you can turn a 100-meter stretch of tunnel into a railgun. It's all crude. It's all dangerous. It's perfect." It was the logic of the mass driver all over again, using their own primitive, brutal technology against a foe that wouldn't even conceive of such tactics, a foe that expected organized resistance, not a sentient, malevolent industrial accident, a new kind of hope, sharp and dangerous, cut through Mara's fear. "Can you do it?" she asked. "Can you control it from there?" Kalen looked around the damaged control sphere. "No, the central systems are too damaged, but I can rig the local controls, eh? I'll have to move through the maintenance shafts, stay ahead of them, and turn our home into a weapon one section at a time." It was a suicide mission. He would be in the walls, a ghost in the machine. With a cohort of elite Covenant soldiers hunting him, Mara knew this. Kalen knew this. But it was the only chance they had. "Jorik," Mara commanded, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Get your people ready. Your job is not to win. Your job is to slow them down, funnel them, lead them into the industrial sectors. Kalen will do the rest." She switched to a colony-wide channel, her voice broadcasting into every home, every workshop, every frightened corner of Haven. "People of Haven," she began, her voice steady and clear. "We have shown the Covenant that we will not break. Now, we will show them that we are not a people to be trifled with. We will show them the meaning of human ingenuity. We will fight them in the tunnels. We will fight them in the smelters. We will make them rue the day they ever found this rock." As she spoke, the first Covenant dropship touched down at the mouth of the canyon, its ramp slamming down onto the red dust with an arrogant, metallic clang. Hulking, armored figures emerged, their silver and black armor gleaming in the dim light. They raised their pulse rifles, their movements fluid and practiced. An overwhelming force ready to crush a primitive settlement. They had no idea they were not invaders. They were sacrifices being fed to a hungry machine. And deep in the bowels of the colony, Kalen grabbed his toolkit, slung a plasma cutter over his shoulder, and disappeared into a service hatch, ready to become the ghost that would haunt them all. The invasion began not with a bang, but with a disciplined, inexorable advance. The Zeth warriors of the first cohort moved with the cold efficiency of a species bred for conquest. Their hulking, armored forms spread out from the landing zone, securing the perimeter of Haven's main plaza with practiced ease. Their movements were precise, their comms chatter minimal, a stark contrast to the chaotic, desperate resistance they had expected. The few shots fired by Jorika's security teams were absorbed harmlessly by their personal energy shields, pathetic sparks against a storm. The Zeth commander, a grizzled veteran named Kresh, scanned the seemingly deserted settlement through his helmet's optical sensors. The silence was unsettling. He had pacified dozens of worlds, crushed rebellions, and put primitive species in their place. There was always screaming, always a futile, passionate charge. This quiet felt wrong. It felt like a trap. Advance teams, report. He grunted into his comms, his voice a low growl. The replies came in, clipped and professional. Sector Alpha, clear. Sector Beta, no hostiles. Thermal scans show civilian life signs clustered in the lower residential block. They are hiding, not fighting. Kresh frowned, his scaled snout wrinkling in suspicion. Praetor Xylar wanted the ones who fired the weapon, the ones with the will to fight. Where were they? He gestured his troops forward, toward the sprawling industrial complex that dominated the far side of the canyon. The energy readings from the weapon had originated from somewhere deep beneath it. That was their objective. Meanwhile, Kalen was moving through the guts of the colony, a phantom in the labyrinthine network of service tunnels and maintenance crawl spaces that honeycombed the canyon walls. The air was thick with the smell of coolant and ionized dust. The distant, percussive sounds of the Zeth's advance were his only guide. He was no soldier, his heart hammered against his ribs, and the plasma cutter on his back felt alien and heavy. But in his hands, his datapad was a familiar comfort. It was linked to the colony's industrial network, a chaotic, jury-rigged system he knew better than anyone. It was his weapon. He reached his first target, the primary junction for the ore smelting facility. It was a cathedral of industry, a vast, cavernous space dominated by a massive, crucible-like furnace and a network of overhead gantries and magnetic cranes. From his perch on a narrow catwalk high above the floor, he could see the first Zeth fire team entering the far end of the chamber, their rifles sweeping the area. They moved cautiously, but with the arrogance of an apex predator entering a new territory. They had no idea the territory itself was the predator. Kalen's fingers flew across his datapad. He bypassed safety protocols, disabled pressure regulators, and overrode the temperature governors on the main plasma furnace. The low hum of the smelter began to climb in pitch, a rising, angry whine. The massive crucible, dormant for years, began to glow. First a dull cherry red, then a brilliant, hateful orange. Down on the floor, the Zeth squad leader paused, his helmet tilting up as he registered the rising temperature. "Report," he barked. Unknown energy surge from the central furnace. Before another word could be spoken, Kalen hit the final command. The emergency purge valve, a colossal iris of reinforced metal at the base of the crucible, slammed open. A torrent of molten slag, superheated to thousands of degrees, erupted from the furnace. It wasn't a clean, directed blast. It was a chaotic, hellish wave of liquid fire that flooded the floor of the chamber. The Zeths were engulfed before they could even scream. Their advanced energy shields flared brilliantly for a single, glorious moment, and then collapsed under the sheer thermal and kinetic onslaught. Their armor, designed to stop plasma bolts, melted like wax. In seconds, the elite warriors of the Stellar Covenant were reduced to blackened, smoldering statues, their forms dissolving into the incandescent river of molten metal. High above the inferno, Kalen watched, his face grim, the heat washing over him in a searing wave. There was no triumph in his heart, only a cold, grim satisfaction. The first blow was struck. He had turned a tool of creation into a weapon of absolute destruction. He didn't linger. He knew more Zeth would be coming to investigate. He slipped back into the darkness of the service tunnels, his datapad already displaying his next target. Kresh received the report of Fire Team Gamma's loss with a stony silence. The telemetry from their armor had been a chaotic burst of extreme temperature readings, and then nothing. He studied the schematic of the industrial sector, the smelter, a primitive, brute force piece of equipment. To use it as a weapon was barbaric. It was also undeniably effective. A flicker of something that might have been respect mingled with his growing fury. These primitives were not just hiding. They were fighting back with a savage cunning he hadn't anticipated. All units, he commanded, his voice a low growl of controlled rage. Standard sweep protocols are suspended. We are no longer clearing a settlement. We are hunting in a hostile environment. Treat every piece of industrial machinery as a potential weapon, and find me the ghost in this machine. He dispatched 2 more fire teams toward the industrial sector, their orders to advance with extreme caution, while he directed the main body of his force toward the residential block. If the primitives wanted to play games in their factories, he would apply pressure elsewhere. He would take their civilians. He would give them something to fear more than his soldiers. The Zeths advanced on the residential block, a tiered complex of living quarters built into the canyon wall. Jorik and his small band of security officers were waiting for them, and they had fortified the main access corridors, creating choke points with welded barricades and scavenged mining equipment. Their plasma rifles were weak, their tactics rudimentary, but they had something the Zeths didn't. They were defending their homes. The first clash was a brutal, one-sided affair. The Zeth's superior shields and weaponry allowed them to punch through the barricades with methodical precision. But Yorik's goal wasn't to win. It was to delay, to bleed them, to make them pay for every inch of ground. They fought like cornered animals, their knowledge of the tight corridors and hidden maintenance hatches giving them a slight, desperate edge. They would fire a few shots from one position, then retreat through a hidden panel into another corridor, forcing the Zeths to clear the same area multiple times. It was a painful, costly strategy, but it was working. It was buying Kalen time. Kalen was now in the atmospheric processing center, a maze of pipes, cryopumps, and ventilation shafts. He heard the sounds of the firefight in the residential block echoing through the vents, and it spurred him on. He found the environmental controls for the main cargo tunnel that connected the industrial and residential sectors. The very tunnel Kresh was now sending his reinforcements through. The system was ancient, relying on massive turbines to circulate air and giant heat exchangers to regulate temperature, with a few quick commands. Kalen slammed shut the emergency blast doors at both ends of the kilometer-long tunnel, trapping the 2 Zeth fire teams inside. Then he rerouted the primary cryocoolant feed, intended for chilling stored gases to near absolute zero, directly into the tunnel's ventilation system. The effect was immediate. A thick, white fog of super-chilled nitrogen began to pour from the ceiling vents. The temperature inside the tunnel plummeted, dropping hundreds of degrees in seconds. The Zeth's helmet displays would have flashed with proximity and temperature warnings. But it was too late. The nitrogen fog flash froze everything it touched. Their energy shields, designed for thermal energy, offered no protection against a state change. The moisture in the air crystallized on their armor, encasing them in a layer of glittering frost. Their weapons seized up, their joints locked. Within a minute, the entire tunnel was a silent, frozen tableau. Two squads of the Covenant's finest warriors turned into ice sculptures, trapped forever in their final, aggressive postures. Back on the Pathfinder, Praetor Xylar watched the telemetry from his ground forces with a growing sense of disbelief. He had lost 3 elite fire teams, 30 of his best warriors, without a single confirmed enemy casualty. They had been burned alive, frozen solid, and for all he knew, there were other horrors waiting in the shadows of this primitive colony. The reports from Kresh were becoming increasingly agitated. The enemy was a ghost, a phantom that used the colony itself as a weapon. This wasn't a pacification, it was a meat grinder. The rage in Xylar's heart cooled into a deadly, focused calm. He had underestimated them. He had allowed his arrogance to blind him to their potential, a fatal mistake, but one he would now correct, and he opened a channel to his chief engineer. Want a full analysis of the kinetic weapon they used against us. Scour the wreckage. Analyze the impact trajectory, the material composition of the projectile. I want to know how it works. I want to know its weaknesses. He then opened a channel to Kresh. Commander, your current strategy is ineffective. You're allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. Your new objective is twofold. First, you will take a civilian hostage. Find their leader, the one they call Mara. Her capture will be broadcast colony-wide. We will break their morale. Second, you will find the power source for this weapon, and you will destroy it. I don't care if you have to crack this moon in half to do it. End this. Now. The hunt had changed. It was no longer a simple search and destroy mission. It had become personal. For Kresh, it was a matter of honor, of avenging his fallen soldiers. For Xylar, it was a matter of intellectual curiosity and cold, calculated extermination. And for Kalen, huddled in a dark ventilation shaft, listening to the Zeth's comms chatter on a stolen frequency, it had become a race against time. They were coming for Mara. They were coming for the driver's power core. He had been the ghost in the machine, but now he had to become its guardian. He looked at the schematics on his datapad, his mind racing. He had used the colony's tools as weapons. Now, he had to use the ultimate weapon as a shield. The plan that formed in his mind was even more insane, even more suicidal than the first. He started moving again, deeper into the moon's crust, back toward the groaning, wounded heart of the mass driver. He was going to give the Covenant exactly what they were looking for. The battle for Haven shifted, becoming a grim, multi-front war. In the residential block, Jorik and his handful of defenders were being systematically cornered. Kresh, his earlier caution replaced by a cold, brutal pragmatism, was no longer trying to outmaneuver them. He was using overwhelming force, blasting through walls, collapsing corridors, and methodically shrinking the pocket of resistance. His objective was clear capture Mara, and the fight would be over. Mara, however, was no passive target. From the besieged overlook, which now served as a command post, she coordinated Jorik's movements, using her intimate knowledge of the colony's layout to guide his fire and fade tactics. She directed civilians through secret passages to safer, deeper shelters, and rerouted what little power they had to reinforce key defensive positions, as she was the heart of the resistance. Her calm, steady voice over the comms, a lifeline for the terrified and a beacon for the defiant. But she knew it was a losing battle. They were bleeding defenders, running out of ammunition, and, Most importantly, running out of time. She could see Kresha's main force converging on the overlooked sector. They knew where she was. The final confrontation was inevitable. She looked at the schematic showing Kalen's lone signal, a single flickering light moving deep into the moon substructure, toward the driver's power core. Whatever he was planning, he had to do it soon. Kalen moved through the substructure with a desperate, focused energy. The air was hot and thick with the smell of scorched earth and leaking plasma. A consequence of the driver's firing. The moon itself seemed to be groaning around him. The rock stressed and fractured. He was no longer just a ghost in the machine. He was a nerve impulse traveling through a dying body. He reached the primary power conduit nexus, a vast, spherical chamber where colossal cables, thick as ancient trees, drew geothermal energy from the moon's molten core and channeled it into the driver's capacitor banks. This was the heart of the beast, the source of the power that had humbled the Covenant, and it was about to become the galaxy's most spectacular booby trap. He began to work, his movements precise and economical despite the tremors that shook the chamber. He wasn't trying to repair the system. He was trying to break it in a very specific, very catastrophic way. He pried open maintenance panels, exposing the raw, glowing plasma conduits within. Using his plasma cutter, he carefully sliced through the magnetic containment rings, not enough to cause a full breach, just enough to weaken them and to make them unstable. He was turning the entire power grid into a bomb with a miles-long fuse. His data pad was his detonator. He was rigging the system to overload on his command, to release 200 years of stored geothermal energy in a single uncontrollable surge. It would not only destroy the driver and a significant portion of the moon, but it would also create an electromagnetic pulse of such staggering magnitude that it would likely fry the systems of any ship in orbit. It was a scorched earth strategy, a final, defiant act of mutual destruction. He would save Haven by destroying its foundation, and likely himself along with it. Above him, on the Pathfinder, the ship's engineers had delivered their preliminary report to Praetor Xylar. It was a testament to the Covenant's analytical prowess. They had pieced it together with astonishing speed. "Praetor," the chief engineer reported, his voice tinged with a reluctant awe. "The weapon is ingenious in its barbarism. It's a simple, linear, magnetic accelerator, an oversized railgun. But its power source is what is truly remarkable. Our scans indicate it is drawing directly from the moon's geothermal core. They have tapped the planet itself as a battery." Xylar processed this information, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. Geothermal, unstable, prone to catastrophic failure if mismanaged, and he finally understood the Primitive's strategy. It wasn't just about a single shot, it was about the threat of another. They were holding their own world hostage. And its weakness, Xylar asked. "The power conduits," the engineer replied. "They must converge somewhere, a central nexus. If we can sever that connection, the weapon is rendered inert. Our deep core scans are still resolving, but we have an approximate location." Xylar nodded. The endgame was clear. "Commander Kresh," he broadcast, his voice cutting through the chaos of the ground battle. "I have a new primary objective for you. I am transmitting the coordinates of the enemy's power nexus. Take your best-equipped fire team. Destroy it. The ghost in their machine will be trapped, its fangs pulled. Then, you may finish with the civilians at your leisure." The message was not encrypted. It was broadcast on an open channel, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. Xylar wanted the resistance to hear it. He wanted them to know that their secret weapon was about to be neutralized, that their last hope was about to be extinguished. In the Overlook, Mara heard the message, and her blood ran cold. On a tactical map, she saw a new icon appear, a Zeth fire team, heavily armed, breaking off from the main assault and heading directly for the coordinates Xylar had just broadcast. They were heading straight for Kaylin. "Kaylin, did you hear that?" she transmitted, her voice tight with desperation. "They're coming for you." Kaylin's reply was grim, but steady. "I heard. Let them come. I'm almost ready for them." He worked faster, his hands a blur of motion as he made the final connections. He could hear them now, the distant, rhythmic thud of their heavy, magnetized boots on the metal gantries of the substructure. They were closing in. He looked at his datapad. The overload sequence was programmed. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was lure them in. Kresh's chosen team, designated Fire Team Omega, was the best of the best. They moved through the substructure with a lethal grace, their advanced sensors cutting through the gloom, guiding them unerringly toward the power nexus. They were the tip of the Covenant's spear, an unstoppable force sent to perform a surgical strike. They reached the entrance to the spherical nexus chamber and paused, scanning for threats. The chamber was silent, save for the low, angry hum of the damaged conduits. In the center of the chamber, they saw him, a lone human figure, standing beside the primary control console, bathed in the eerie light of the exposed plasma feeds. He was just standing there, waiting for them. The Omega leader motioned for his team to spread out, to surround him. They raised their pulse rifles, the targeting lasers from a dozen weapons converging on Kaylin's chest. "Surrender. Primitive." The leader growled, his voice amplified by his helmet's external speaker. "Your resistance is over." Kaylin didn't raise his hands. He just held up his datapad, its screen glowing with the overload sequence he had prepared. He looked not at the soldiers in front of him, but up, as if at a hidden camera. He knew Xylar was watching. He had to be. This was his message to the Praetor, to the entire Covenant. "You wanted to see what a desperate human is capable of," Kaylin said, his voice calm, broadcast over the same open frequency Xylar had used. "You wanted to dissect our cunning. Well, here's your lesson." He smiled, a tired, defiant grin. "Class is dismissed." With that, he tapped the screen of his datapad. The effect was instantaneous. The low hum of the chamber rose to a deafening shriek. The weakened containment fields on the plasma conduits failed. Raw, untamed energy, the very lifeblood of the moon, erupted from the cables. Arcs of blue-white plasma, thick as his arm, lashed out across the chamber, turning the air to superheated gas. Fire Team Omega was caught in the heart of the storm. Their shields flared and died in the same millisecond. Their armor vaporized. They were annihilated, not by a weapon, but by a force of nature that had been deliberately unleashed. But this was just the prelude. The overload cascended through the system, a chain reaction of catastrophic failures racing back through the miles of conduits. The entire moon began to vibrate, a low, resonant frequency that climbed higher and higher. Kaylin was thrown from his feet as the floor buckled. He knew he had only seconds. As the plasma storm engulfed the chamber, he threw himself into a small, lead-lined service shaft he had left open, a desperate gamble against a wave of pure energy. He slammed the heavy hatch shut just as the main overload hit. On the bridge of the Pathfinder, Praetor Xylar watched in stunned silence as the telemetry from Fire Team Omega vanished and the energy readings from the moon went off the scale. A planet-wide electromagnetic pulse, more powerful than anything he had ever witnessed, erupted from the surface. The lights on his bridge flickered and died. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks. The Pathfinder, along with the rest of the Covenant ships in orbit, was plunged into darkness, their systems fried, their engines dead. They were adrift, helpless. The primitives hadn't just destroyed their own weapon, they had taken his entire fleet out of the fight. The sheer, suicidal brilliance of the act left him breathless. Below, the ground battle had come to an abrupt halt. The Zeth's advanced equipment, their rifles, their comms, their shields were all dead, rendered inert by the EMP. They were now just hulking, reptilian soldiers, armed with useless chunks of metal, facing a swarm of enraged humans armed with scavenged, low-tech shotguns and sharpened pieces of scrap metal. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami. Yorick and his defenders, their primitive slug throwers unaffected by the pulse, surged from their defensive positions. The hunters had become the hunted. In the Overlook, Mara watched the chaos on a battery-powered emergency monitor. She saw the Zeths falling back in disarray, and a fierce, triumphant joy swelled in her chest. But her eyes were fixed on the tactical map, on the spot where Kalen's signal had been. It was gone. He had saved them all, but the cost, she feared, had been everything. The moon shuddered one last time, a final, agonized groan, and then a new, terrifying silence fell over Haven. The silence that followed the EMP was more profound than any noise. It was a dead quiet, the absence of the hum of technology that had been the constant, subliminal soundtrack to life in Haven. Emergency lights, powered by independent chemical batteries, flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows through the corridors of the Overlook. Mara stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the tactical display where Kalen's signal had vanished. The victory felt hollow, the silence an accusation. They were alive, they were free, but the architect of their salvation was gone, consumed by the very fire he had unleashed. The sounds of sporadic, primitive combat from outside the boom of a shotgun, the clang of metal on metal, the guttural cries of the Zeth were a distant, disconnected reality. The war for Haven was won, but the cost felt immeasurable. Yorick's voice, ragged and breathless, crackled over a short-range, battery-powered radio. Mara, we're pushing them back. They're disorganized, blind. Their chain of command is shattered. I think we're winning. There was a sense of disbelief in his own words. Mara keyed the radio, her voice heavy. Hold your ground, Yorick. Consolidate your position. Don't get reckless. And find me a damage report from the substructure. I need to know what's left down there. It was a fool's hope, but she had to ask. She had to know if anything, or anyone, could have survived the overload. Days bled into a week. The cleanup was a grim, arduous process. The surviving Zeth warriors, stripped of their technology and stranded on a hostile world, were hunted down or surrendered, their formidable presence reduced to that of cornered, exhausted animals. The colony began the monumental task of rebuilding. The EMP had been a double-edged sword. While it had crippled the invaders, it had also fried most of Haven's non-essential systems. They were thrown back into a darker age, relying on candlelight, manual labor, and the simple yet robust machinery that had been shielded deep within the moon's crust. But they were alive, and more importantly, they were free. In orbit, the Covenant fleet was a silent, drifting graveyard. Their ships were powerless, their crews trapped in metal coffins, a stark testament to Kalen's final, defiant act. It would be months, perhaps years, before any rescue or patrol stumbled upon them. For the first time in 2 centuries, humanity's last sanctuary was truly safe. A search team, led by a solemn Leah, finally managed to clear a path through the collapsed and irradiated tunnels leading to the power nexus. The devastation was absolute. The spherical chamber was gone, replaced by a massive, crater-like cavern of melted and resolidified rock. The radiation levels were still dangerously high, and of Fire Team Omega, there was no trace. Of Kalen, there was only the scorched, melted remains of his datapad, fused to the floor just inches from the mangled wreckage of a lead-lined service hatch. Leah brought the datapad back to the Overlook and placed it gently on the console in front of Mara. It was their only relic, the final testament of the man who had saved them. Mara grieved, not with tears, but with a quiet, fierce resolve. She poured her energy into rebuilding Haven, her leadership a pillar of strength for the weary colonists. They salvaged what they could from the dead Covenant ships, reverse engineering the simpler, more robust technologies and adapting them to their own needs. Haven began to transform. It was no longer just a hiding place. It was becoming a fortress, a symbol of a new, resilient humanity. The story of Kalen, the cynical engineer who became their savior, passed into legend. He was the ghost in the machine, the man who had thrown a rock at the gods and then brought down the heavens to protect his home. The children of Haven would grow up hearing his name spoken with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. One evening, months after the battle, Leah approached Mara in the quiet of the Overlook. She had been painstakingly working on Kalen's melted datapad, hoping to recover some fragment of its data. "I found something," she said, her voice soft. She handed a small, newly fabricated data chip to Mara. Most of the memory was slag, but a few protected sectors survived. "It's not much, just a fragmented audio file, a personal log, I think, recorded just before the end." Mara took the chip, her hand trembling slightly. That night, alone in her quarters, she played the file. The sound was distorted, laced with static and the deafening roar of the overloading core. But Kalen's voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a grand speech or a heroic farewell. It was quiet, reflective, the words of a man facing his own imminent end. "Funny," the voice crackled. "Spent my whole life fixing things, believing in logic, in systems, hated the messy, illogical parts, the people. But in the end, it wasn't the machine that mattered. It was them. Mara, Auric, Leah, all of them. Stubborn, illogical, infuriating, and worth it. Guess that's a system I never really understood." The recording cut out in a final, violent burst of static. Mara sat in the darkness, the silence of her room pressing in on her as a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He had understood after all. He had understood perfectly. The rebuilding continued, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Haven was no longer just a secret to be kept. It was a promise to be fulfilled. They were the inheritors of a legacy, the keepers of a flame that had almost been extinguished. They began to send out probes, carefully shielded and designed to be unobtrusive, searching the nearby star systems not for enemies, but for whispers, for echoes, for other lost colonies of humanity. The galaxy was a vast, dangerous place, but Kalen had taught them that even the smallest, most forgotten corner of it could roar with defiance. 2 years after the Battle of Haven, a long-range probe returned a signal. It was faint, heavily degraded, but unmistakably human, an old Earth distress call, repeating on a loop for centuries from a gas giant on the edge of the Seraphim Nebula. A new debate began in the Colony Council. To respond was to risk exposure. To ignore it was to betray the very essence of what they had fought for. Mara, standing before the council, her face lined with the burdens of leadership, but her eyes clear and resolute, cast the deciding vote. "We are not hiders anymore," she declared. "We are survivors, and we are not alone." A new ship was built in the hidden hangars of Haven. It was not a sleek, elegant vessel like the Covenant's. It was ugly, blocky, and over-engineered. Its armor was a patchwork of salvaged Covenant alloys and locally forged iron. Its primary weapon was a scaled-down, ship-mounted version of the Mass Driver. It was a brute of a ship, a testament to their history, their struggle, and their philosophy. They named it the Kalen. As Mara stood on the bridge of the Kalen, watching the ethereal colors of the nebula swirl on the main view screen, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. They were setting out into the unknown, not as fugitives, but as explorers, as messengers of hope. They were the children of Haven, the inheritors of a ghost's legacy, ready to find the scattered remnants of their people and remind the galaxy that humanity, in all its stubborn, illogical, and infuriating glory, was not a variable to be corrected. It was a force to be reckoned with. The ship's engines hummed with a familiar, brute force power, and with a slow, deliberate grace. It turned its nose toward the distant stars and, leaving the red dust and the silent, watchful ghosts of Gideon's Rock behind. The age of hiding was over, and the age of humanity's return had just begun.